Welcome to our podcast. We are so excited to have you along for this journey. My name is Madison, and I'm the Executive Director of Peace Restored. I will be your host as we discuss mental health and faith in our podcast, Seeking Healing, Finding Hope, which is a production of Peace Restored, a 501c3 nonprofit located in Indiana and serving women everywhere. Today on our podcast, I have Rebekah back with me today, and so I'm grateful that you can join and we can continue the conversation on boundaries. For those who didn't listen to our last podcast, we talked about the first 5 laws of boundaries. So do you mind reviewing those laws for our listeners?
Yeah. So law 1, the law of sowing and reaping. Law 2, law of responsibility. Law 3, the law of power or powerlessness. Mm-hmm. And then law 4, the law of respect. And last, the law 5 was the law of motivation.
Yeah, so there's a lot of good information that we learned about these different laws from the last time. They're all super important as we learn how to interact and set good and healthy boundaries. So if you didn't get a chance to hear that podcast, we would encourage you to go back and listen to the last one on boundaries. All of them have been really good in this series. This is our 4th podcast on the topic of boundaries. And so I would encourage you actually to go back and listen to all 4 of them in order, but just to kind of get more information, it would be good for you to go back and listen to those last 5 laws. But today we're going to delve into the next 5. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this will be a good conversation as we learn more about what it means to have a law or, what we need to do to set those boundaries. So the first law that we're going to jump into is the law of evaluation. So that could sound a little complicated when you think about what does it mean to the law of evaluation in relation to boundaries.
Yeah, what am I evaluating?
Yeah. So what are some things that come up, do you think, that when you're thinking about evaluating a boundary, what are some things that people might want to consider?
It's definitely good to keep in mind and to think about the boundary that you're going to be setting and evaluating the pain that that's going to cause somebody else on the other side of it. And then taking that a little further and then to sympathize with just realizing that it's going to cause them pain and to be able to come alongside them in that, but still set your boundary. Yeah.
Because when we set a boundary, by nature, sometimes they do cause discomfort.
Yeah.
Because we may not like the boundary somebody sets around us or for us or towards us, I guess is another way to put it. And so sometimes there's discomfort in that.
Yeah, and you might hurt somebody else's feelings by the boundary that you set. And so if you can be aware of that before you set the boundary and you still want to show that person you care about them, but you're just doing what's best for you.
Yeah. Yeah, because if we don't practice this law of evaluation, our tendency can be to want to go in and try to fix it, and fix it not in the right way, like they're hurting, so I want to take away their hurt. But there's a value in that pain sometimes.
Yeah, something good can come of it, or that person can learn something for the better that can end up helping your relationship.
Yeah, I think it was either the podcast we did last time or maybe the one before. But whenever we are growing, when we are growing, there is pain involved.
Yeah.
Of all types of growth, right? So you think about physical growth. A lot of times kids will have, we call them growing pains.
Yeah.
They'll have that physical pain in their body. It might be you're trying to get more physically fit. You're going to have some pain with that.
You're going to be a little sore for a while.
Yeah.
But then the results later down the road are better for you.
Yeah, so we have to allow pain. Pain isn't always bad. And so the pain that we're talking about today is a healthy pain. Yeah. Because it comes out of a space of growth. And so we have to allow sometimes those around us to feel the pain or discomfort that comes from a boundary being set.
Yeah.
And so that kind of goes back to the beginning of the Boundaries book by Dr. Cloud and Townsend, which is the idea of being responsible for and to.
Yeah.
And so do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? Do you remember all the prints? So, we could be responsible to someone, or we can be, but we're responsible for ourselves, right? And so we have to be responsible for, but when we're responsible to them, that's what we're talking about here today, right?
Yeah, so being responsible to somebody would look like coming alongside them when they're experiencing pain that are caused by your boundaries. And so, and then you're being responsible for yourself and setting your boundary.
Yeah, so it doesn't mean we may be able to sit with that person and say, man, I can see this is uncomfortable for you. And just acknowledge that discomfort. You could acknowledge how hard this might be for them. That doesn't mean you change your boundary.
Yeah.
That just means you're being with them. You're in the space with them, especially if you're in relationship with them. It might be healthy for you to be able to say, I can, if you're in a good, healthy place with them, to be able to hear them out.
Yeah.
And say, tell me why this is so hard.
Yeah. Because if it's very common and natural to be afraid of hurting somebody's feelings and causing that pain. But what ends up happening is if you then pull back your boundary and don't stick to it, then you're just going to keep confusing the relationship, and you're not going to get better. You're just going to stay in the same place.
Yeah, it causes a kind of a crazy making cycle. Yeah. Almost it can feel like, here we are, we're doing this again. But when you can hold that line, evaluating what's happening. Yeah. Okay, what is it that I need to reflect on? What is it that they need to reflect on? And give each other space to talk about that. That's a healthy dynamic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so good for us to be able to do that. I think another thing for us to kind of remember in this is just because someone is showing outward signs of being upset, it doesn't mean that what we did was bad.
Yeah.
And I don't know about our listeners, but that can be a hard one for me sometimes. If somebody around me is reacting, depending on the dynamic, I might want to comfort.
Yeah.
If they're yelling at me, I might want to run away. So it just depends. Everybody responds differently.
And you just might feel at fault for them being angry, so you want to fix it, like you said.
Yeah. Right. So it just depends. So we have to remember that when we're in that space, right, we've set that boundary, maybe they become reactive. Just because they react badly doesn't mean it's your job to fix their reactivity. Yeah. And that can be hard, but it's a necessary part to let them feel what they need to feel. And that might be the time where you need to excuse yourself for a little bit or pull away, or let them feel what they need to feel. Once they're in a better space, then that's when you can come together and work that out together. Yeah. It's okay to take a break.
And give them that appropriate amount of time to experience those feelings and emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next law that we're going to talk about now is the law of being proactive. Proactivity. So proactive versus reactive, right? And we've talked a little bit about that already. And so let's talk a little bit about the difference between what does it mean to be proactive versus reactive?
Yeah. So reactive is more not taking that time to sit with your emotions and thoughts and attitudes, and you just react without thinking about any consequences. Being proactive would be to take that time to really work through those thoughts and feelings first.
Yeah, so that proactive, right? You're kind of thinking through it ahead of time. You're not just jumping in, right?
Not letting your emotions control the situation.
Yeah, because sometimes that can be, we're in a very much of a culture where our feelings take lead.
Yeah.
And we can sometimes get stuck in that pattern of where we let our feelings lead us. And so when that happens, that can take us down a very reactive state.
I think, too, it's a myth that your feelings are the truth, right? And they're not. What I've learned is my feelings are a warning sign, or they're something to get my attention to then find the truth, but they're not the truth itself.
Yeah, so our feelings are definitely, like you said, there's something for us to wrestle with, to think through. They're, like you said, they're something for us to go, I need to think through this. What's going on here?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure why I'm having this feeling. It doesn't mean that every feeling is invalid. We're not saying that, but not every feeling is factual.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something we have to wrestle through, because if we take every feeling as factual, then we will jump into reactivity.
Yeah, and look for somebody to blame that feeling on.
Mm-hmm.
That was another thing I just remembered too, taking responsibility for that feeling.
Yeah.
It's not somebody else's responsibility, it's ours.
Yeah. We're responsible for our feelings. While someone's actions can trigger a feeling or a response, it doesn't mean that it's there. We put that on them. We have to choose how we respond and what we do with that. So it's really important as we process through how those feelings affect us. So as we continue to think about proactivity, what are some things that if we think about a person who is being proactive, what are some maybe the traits or characteristics that we might think of that a person has when they are proactive?
Yeah, so a proactive person would usually be known for the things that they love, their purpose, what they enjoy, what they stand for. And then the opposite would be the reactive person, and they're mainly known for things that they hate, things that they don't like, that they stand against, and are very passionate on the opposite side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's a little bit of differentiation between the two, right? Yeah. So we have to be careful. And I think a lot of times we can fall into both.
Yeah.
We're not saying that everybody's 100% one or 100% the other.
Yeah.
It's just sometimes we have more tendency. We might have a tendency to do one or the other. And sometimes it could be things that trigger us or experiences that we're having. A whole lot of things can happen that can trigger those different things. But it's important for us to recognize which one we're in, if we're being a proactive state or a reactive state.
To recognize too, when those triggers are happening.
Mm-hmm. Another time when reactivity might become really normalized for a person is if they've had a long history of maybe victimization or abuse or some type of trauma history. There may be a normalization for them to be more reactive because for them that's become a necessary coping.
Yeah.
And so learning how to pivot that and recognizing that, oh, something just happened. It's triggering a response mechanism from the past because I've been in the past in this abusive, traumatic environment. And so therefore, when this thing happens, whatever that thing is, I become reactive. And so it's almost like we have to really step back and take time and learn how can I not respond out of my hard places or my trauma, so that way I can learn not to be reactive. And that can be a challenge if you've been through a long trauma or if you've had a history of trauma or abuse.
Yeah, and I remember reading the other day too that it's completely necessary for a phase of time, for a little bit of time, for somebody to have a reactive phase, for them to find their power again, their sense of power.
Yeah.
You just can't stay in that place, or you end up adopting that victim mentality for too long. And you start to see that in other areas as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because some of that, like you said, it's going to be necessary, especially as you're pivoting and you're learning and you're growing. So, so reactivity in itself isn't bad. It's just we have to be careful of how we use reactivity. So the next law that we're going to move to then is the law of envy. So this law, and I'm just thinking of the word envy. You know, we think of being envious or
jealous.
Yeah, jealous. Jealous is another good word. So I was just thinking, I'm wondering how many people use the word envy in the everyday language. They may not. But jealousy is a really good way for people to think about that.
Envious of what other people have that you don't have. Jealous of it.
Jealous, yeah. So when you look around, you might be like, oh. and that can be an easy thing for us to fall into, is being jealous or envious of what others have. And it could be in physical possessions. What are some other ways that you think people might be envious?
Well, even in today with social media, people, they want to show the best versions of themselves. Yes. And so all the photos you might see online, it can paint a perfect picture of perfect families, nobody ever fighting, just the best possible outcomes of everything that people want to celebrate, right? You don't want to put depressing things online. But that I've known some people to struggle with that, you look at, just these perfect models of people, right? And you're like, well, I don't have that. Why don't I have that?
Yeah, because it could be because it's easy to put up just all the pretty stuff online, but then it could set up this false sense of expectation of this is what should be. Mm-hmm. And so then we become envious or jealous of, man, why can't my life be that perfect? Yeah,
you can go down a rabbit hole that way and end up just not feeling good enough or worthy enough in general. And so
you see, like what they call it, the Instagram life. You see kind of the Instagram life of everything is just put together. Every relationship you have is perfect.
Everything filtered.
Yeah, everything's filtered, right? Mm-hmm. So you have that filter of perfection, and perfection isn't reality.
Yeah.
So it skews what we believe should be true in our boundaries. So it's almost then like we put up the expectation sometimes for others to have perfection in that relationship.
Yeah, that's another facet.
Yeah.
It's not a realistic expectation.
No, it is not. But it's, it can be a really challenge of, especially like you said, in the world we live in today with everything we see around us. We can even do that in areas of not just things and relationship, but also man, there's no, look at how far they've gotten in their job.
Yeah, success in their career.
Yeah, or wow, they got their degree, or I've always wanted to do that. And we start to do this comparison game.
Yeah.
So when we tend to focus on what others have, we can neglect our own responsibilities. And ultimately, it takes us to this place where we have this emptiness on the inside, right? Because we're trying to fill it up with all the things that we don't have or we can't have. And so it leaves this void I wish I had.
Yeah.
It's almost like it leaves us in this place of, I think of it's being kind of like a wishful life, almost like a fairy tale life. I want all these things, and it leaves just, like I said, this void, and we can't have it because it's setting us up for a place of unrealistic expectations.
Never being content.
Yeah. That's a big one, right? Yeah. Contentment. Mm-hmm. Contentment and envy are kind of the opposite of each other, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The discontent goes along with envy, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh. That can be really heavy, right?
Yeah.
Because I don't think our culture teaches contentment.
No.
Yeah. It teaches try harder, do more.
Be more selfish.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Get more things.
You'll be happy if you have all the things, all the money.
Have the perfect Instagram, Pinterest life.
Yeah. Perfect husband, perfect life.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. You have the 2.5 kids and a dog.
Yeah.
All the things, right? So we want to have perfection. Mm-hmm. We want to have what looks picture perfect. And when we seek those things that are not perfect, it sets up an expectation that just leaves this big gaping hole in our heart that we just can't fill.
Yeah.
So we have to be able to switch to contentment, like you were talking about, being able to focus on what we do have. Find it goes back to that old principle of counting our blessings.
Yeah. Also, it makes me think too, after reading through this section in the book, pointing out that all of those things too, most of them anyway, that you might find yourself being envious of, you can also attain those things though if God is wanting you to have them and to put action behind.
Yes.
If you're envious, which can lead to bitterness and resentment towards that person. Instead, you can take action to do more homework and finish that degree that your friend just finished.
Yeah, so it's taking it from envy to action.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big differentiation, right? Because like you said, if you stay in that envious state, you're going to become bitter, resentment. But if we say, okay, listen, this is a goal I've always had, is to go back to school, to do whatever. Maybe it's go back to school, maybe it's something else. Then set it up as a goal.
Yeah.
Don't just sit and focus on what you don't have. Move towards what you can have.
Because God will reward that action. If you're participating, even if he gives you something different, a different reward, you'll still get rewarded for trying something.
Right. Yeah, because we don't know what we can succeed until we try.
Yeah.
But if we sit and we focus on what we don't have, we're never going to try.
It's never going to get you anywhere.
No. Yeah, so there's so much we can do with that, and just focusing on contentment, goals. Where are we going? What are we trying to work towards?
Yeah.
So then the next law that we have is the law of activity.
Yeah, it's kind of what we were just saying. Those boundaries can only be created if you're actually doing and putting into action, doing something.
Yeah. So we can't just sit and hope.
Yeah, without doing a little of the work and setting that boundary and sticking to it.
Yeah, so it's not just in the goals of achieving something, right? Like a degree, like we've talked about. It's being active and pursuing the reasons why I feel what I feel. Not just going, man, I keep feeling this really hard space, or I'm anxious every time this thing happens. Well, maybe you need to take a moment and go, what actions do I need to take responsibility, one, for those feelings, maybe an attitude, a belief, whatever that is, behavior, and then work through that. That's the action. The action is, how do I process through? How do I grow through this? How do I learn through this? Instead of just staying in that space of, man, that just happened again. Yeah.
Yeah, passivity.
Yeah, passivity. Yeah.
Which is hard, because passivity is the easier route. Just to sit back and hopefully everything will fix itself. And you stay being a kind person and you're giving to all these people. But then you start to feel that resentment and bitterness grow because you're not setting boundaries and you're being passive with it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
So it could be really easy to stay in a space of, this is as good as it's going to get. Have you ever heard anybody say that?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, not that we have to name names, I don't want to do that. But if you think about that person, because I have some people that I've known that have been like, man, this is just as good as it's going to get. What does their life tend to look like?
Exactly, where they stay in the exact same place.
Yeah.
It's like they give themselves permission to stay there.
Yeah. And then sometimes, not all of them, but sometimes that you can see that bitterness or that resentment grow. Yep, this is what I thought it was. This is as good as it's going to get. It's never going to get any better.
It's like proving their theory right.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's where that action comes in, is we have to take responsibility. We have to be willing to do the work and to do the hard things. To maybe it is going into counseling if that's what you need. Maybe it's going to a group. What are some of the things people can do to take action for their responsibilities, or take action towards their feelings or their attitudes and behaviors?
Well, they could maybe journal a little bit to try to figure out what they're feeling, to kind of lead them in a positive direction. What's a couple other ones?
They could listen to a good podcast.
Hey,
maybe do that.
Yeah, that would for sure help.
Yeah, that might help. We hope. So they can learn things, right? They could, whether it's a podcast, YouTube, they could take a class.
Yeah, you start by searching for something.
Maybe it's have a conversation with somebody.
Yeah.
Somebody that's a healthy person. You need to find a safe and healthy person, which is something, if you don't know what a safe person is, we're actually going to be doing a podcast on that in a few weeks. So if you're like, well, I think I know what a safe person, but I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Come back in a few weeks and we're going to have we're going to do a whole podcast on how do you find a safe person? What does that look like? How do I identify safe people in my life? Because sometimes that can be really a challenge for people.
Yeah.
But when we're processing through these areas of growth, we want to make sure we're doing that with somebody that's safe.
Yeah. It can be hard to find those safe people. They can seem safe and become actually not being safe. So just to be able to learn to look for those red flags or just those confirmations would be really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. So knowing how to do all that. Yeah. Like you said, looking for all those red flags and how to find that person to connect with is so important.
Yeah.
And if you don't have a safe person, again, that might be where you go, okay, maybe I do need to go in for counseling. Maybe I do need to find someone to talk through. And that's acceptable as well if that's what you're looking for. If you're a woman over the age of 18, you listen to this podcast and you're like, man, that's me and I need help to process through some things I've been in, you can reach out to our office. Just go to our website of peacerestored.net and you can go in and you can find ways to contact us either through email, or we have our phone number, our social media, all the different ways you can connect with us. And then you'll end up getting connected with Taylor on our staff, and she'll direct you in the right way of what the next steps would be. But also, if you are just looking, if we're not the right fit for you, and that's okay, we're not the right fit for everybody, and we understand that. We're happy to recommend other organizations or other places that you might be able to receive services from. So, please don't hesitate to reach out. We want to be a service.
Part of the activity, the active part.
Yeah, it's not just the podcast that we're here for. We're here because we want to serve the whole person. Yeah, but you're right. It's part of the activity for the listener that, like, if I'm in a place where I need to do something, maybe my next action step is to reach out for help.
Yeah.
To find a safe place to process. Yeah. So that also reminds me of another podcast that we have coming up called that we're going to be talking about is when do I need to reach out for help? Because sometimes we don't know. So again, we're going to be doing a bunch of good topics coming up. We're not going to be talking about boundaries forever. So if somebody's been listening to this for a while, they might be like, oh, are they going to talk about something else other than boundaries? Yes. So we have some other good topics coming up. So make sure you come back and listen in as we continue to talk about other topics. But so that brings us up to the last law, which is the law of exposure. So let's expand a little bit on that idea of law of exposure. What does it mean to have that law, and how does that affect us when in relationship to boundaries?
Yeah, so the law of exposure is talking about those internal boundaries that you might have and exposing them to the correct people. You need to be able to communicate what's going on inside clearly to address those. Kind of put them out into the light, because in the light is where the healing can happen.
Yeah. I love that, that in the light, that's where the healing can happen.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, even just in our own self, we want to keep it a secret. We don't want to talk about. We want to just not expose it, right? Because if somebody knows what I've been through, then it's going to be too much.
Yeah,
or
they won't
scary.
Stick around, they'll leave.
Yeah, they might leave me. It's scary. It's all the things. There's lots of fear that can come up, right, with being vulnerable. Now, by no means were we saying that you need to go onto the rooftop and start shouting out like, hey, world. It's more of like, again, it goes back to that safe person, right? Who can I safely expose the things I need to expose, that I need to talk about. Those internal boundaries that might have been crossed, or the boundaries that might the emotional boundaries that might have been crossed, that we might need to talk about those to somebody, expose those thoughts.
Yeah.
So some of the internal boundaries that we might want to think through deal with relational fears, right? And so some of those relational fears are fears of guilt. And we talked about some of these already, right? Not being liked, that loss of connection. So there's lots of things that come up, right? So we don't have approval of others. It could be, what are some other ones that you can kind of think of that might
Just loss of the love or connection you might have already established. Just the fear of being truly known, receiving the anger from the other side as well.
Yeah.
All of those things you're afraid of those things, but they can only be addressed within that relational situation.
Yeah. 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 So those can be really hard things to wrestle with, right? When you said the being known, the thought popped in my head of, I think a lot of the women I've worked with, I think being known is one of the things, but I think another word that came to mind was being seen or being acknowledged. That can be a really hard place for a lot of people is I just want people to see me or to acknowledge me or to value. I think all that kind of clumps together for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I think especially women. Maybe men, I'm sure men too, but I since we work predominantly with women, that's what I know.
Yeah.
So when we think about our boundaries, especially since we're talking about our internal boundaries in relationship to being that law of exposure, right? So we have to think about how do we communicate well and how do we communicate those to others. So can you think of an example of how we might be able to do that? How do we communicate to others about what those boundaries might be?
Yeah. I could think of maybe saying to the person that crossed that internal boundary to say, hey, when you said this is what feeling was provoked from that, or just being clear that when you did this hurt my feelings. If that happens again, I'm going to just excuse myself, something like that.
Yeah. So I think it goes back to the idea of just being really clear.
Yeah.
And saying, this is what's happening with me. I can't stay in this space with you when that boundary is crossed within me. And you don't always have to use the word boundary. You could just say, when this happens, right? Because sometimes it can be a little confusing when we use the word boundary a lot.
I know.
When somebody doesn't understand the word boundary. So it's okay not to use the word boundary.
Yeah.
But to say maybe like, when this happens, I feel, and I need to be able to take a break.
Yeah.
Or I need, what is it that, and I would challenge you, as you're listening to this, if that's you, if that happens to you, think before this, because you're going to have boundaries crossed, but think beforehand, what is it that you do need to do?
Yeah.
What is it? Do you need to take a break? Do you need to are you a processor? Do you need to go journal? Do you need to go for a walk? Yeah. What is it that you need to do before you can go deeper? Yeah. Because if you know what that answer is, it'll be a lot easier to do it when you're in that hard space.
When you're in that moment.
Yeah.
Because you're in control of what you do and how you respond.
Yeah. But if you wait, kind of back to what we were talking about earlier, if you wait until everything's happening, that's when we can tend to be more reactive. So if we think about it ahead of time and we're planning it out, now we're being proactive. I know. Look at how we did that.
That's good. Yeah.
Yeah. So we want to make sure we're doing those things, so that way we can plan and we can be able to address things when they come up, because that reactive state isn't a healthy place for us to be in. It ends up causing usually friction in a relationship.
Yeah. So if you can be prepared, you know that the boundary is going to be crossed. You already know that. It's going to continue happening. And so if you can maybe find it helpful to just rehearse in your head the things you would say when it happens again. And then that way it would be like fresh in your memory.
Yeah. Yeah, because we have to be able to communicate that a boundary's been crossed.
Yeah.
Because what tends to happen sometimes in relationships is we don't tell the other person that a boundary's been crossed, and we just expect them to know by magical mind reading that you're upset because they crossed a line.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever done that.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I mean, I'm sure I haven't, but I'm sure my husband would tell you quite differently.
Right.
He'd be like, I'm sure most of the staff would be like, Ann. But anyways, it's but there's times where we cross those lines, but if we don't communicate clearly to each other and say, that was not good. That was not cool. that did not feel good. And the person may not have the intent.
Yeah.
They might be like, I didn't intend to hurt you. Well, that's great. I'm glad that you didn't intend to hurt me, but the result was this thing. And I need to talk through this with you when you're ready, right? Mm-hmm. To talk through that with them, to say, when this happens, when you do A, I feel B, but this is how if we could do, when A happens, if we could do this differently, and you help them see what you need, then it can change the dynamic of the relationship.
And it gives them the opportunity to grow and to fix the situation.
Yeah. So, but you may need, again, like we were saying, is that you may need, when you're giving that example to the person you're in a relationship with, you may need to first take a minute, take a breath, go for a walk, go journaling, whatever that is. But that's where we're being that proactive. Okay, how do I make a plan of what do I need to do so I can take care of myself well, so I can go back into this space, have the conversation, clearly define to the other person what happened, not being angry and reactive and
in a calm state.
Non-threatening. So important.
Yeah.
Yeah, because again, we both may have done this at a time or two in a relationship. I don't know.
Not you.
I mean, not me. I do everything right. No. Is that you may at times get upset and start yelling at the person, right? And start saying things you wouldn't intend to. Mm-hmm. But if you know what you need ahead of time, so when you're triggered or boundaries crossed, you can go, oh, I need to take a break. I need to go for a walk, and then go back into that space. It's so important.
Which will then start over time alleviating all of that anger. And you won't need the anger anymore.
Yeah. You won't. So it begins to shift the relationship, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So can you imagine what a relationship would change to if they start implementing the things that we've been talking about?
Yeah.
How do you think that would affect a dynamic?
I think that if you were able to start implementing those things, it gives the relationship an opportunity to become more intimate, closer to the other person. And as a result, it could make you would then be addressing those relational fears because, for example, the feeling known, you would have then shared a part of yourself with the other person. And when received well and addressed, then you can heal that area.
Yeah, I love that, because when you can share a part of yourself to them, and like you said, gave the example of you want to be known, when that other person can hear you and sit in that space with you and accept and hear and be able to transition with you and go, okay, I can hear and acknowledge the boundary that you need, and I'm going to walk through this with you, you now feel known and seen.
Exactly.
And now that causes intimacy. And that relationship shifts. But when the other person can't do that, it does the opposite. But it's so beautiful when we can do those things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's a good place for us to end, I think. And thinking about boundaries is how they can be such a good tool to shift our relationships into something that can be so beautiful.
Yeah.
So thank you for talking about boundaries with me again today. And as we wrap up this part of the series of boundaries, we'll address boundaries again later in this year. Like we mentioned before, we will have boundaries in our Classes on Demand 2 coming up. So it is an important topic for us to continue to talk about.
Yeah.
But over the next few weeks, we're going to be delving into some new topics. So that'll be fun. I know. I can't wait to do some more topics. So again, hopefully you'll come back to listen to our other podcast. And if you haven't had a chance to share this with others, please do so. But thank you guys for joining us today on our podcast. And again, just if you need to know how to find our podcast, if you aren't listening to us on a podcatcher, you can go to our website, which is peacerestored.net, and you can check out, find our podcast on there. Or you can listen to them on YouTube. Like I know many people have been listen to them on YouTube as well. In the meantime, if you'd like to learn more about us, you can check us out on our social media pages, Instagram and Facebook as well. Don't forget to check out our show notes. And you'll be able to find all the links we mentioned, additional content, and maybe some few video links as well. We're working on the project that I talked about, which is the classes on demand. And so over the next few months, you're going to hear more information about that and be able to find out how you can sign up for our classes on demand. We're so excited about this option because it allows everybody the option to come in and receive mental health care as they're ready and go about it at their own pace. So make sure to be watching for the announcement of that release date. 'Cause like I said, we're really excited about it. As we wrap up our discussion today, make sure to stay tuned as we begin to share with you practical ways where you too can seek healing and find hope. Join us on our next podcast where we will continue to discuss mental health and faith. So come back next time for transformation, growth, and power. This is Peace Restored.